There it is. Okay, recording's up. That is definitely not the number of people who are supposed to be here, so we're gonna give it a while. Thank you, pineapple juice. On the event, there were like around 40 people, so we're gonna give it a moment. I'm gonna keep on saying this over and over until we get more people in, but I guess some people forgot that or didn't read that I was moving it back. Well, if they don't go in by like 5:17 or 5:18, we will start the lecture, I suppose. And they will have to listen in on parts of the recording to get whatever they missed. So, for those of you who are here, this unit is more impactful than the unit we did before. Sorry, I internally burped. Simply because the weighting is around 10%. No, that's too much. It's more than 4 to 6%. It's not the most consequential. That would be Unit 3. That's where we're going to start splitting lectures up. But this unit, I think we can do it in 2 hours. I'm hoping we can do it in 2 hours. It's just 7 topics. 6 topics. Thank you. Instructional time, 10%. Yes. So we'll be spending a little less time on this than we would for other units. Hi, reading. Let me check in the A-Push channel. Nope. Damn, no one really read the announcements. So, I guess we're gonna go through the ropes. People will probably just trickle in as we go. So, today's lecture is gonna be on Unit 2, which is 1607 to 1754. Yes, that is correct. So, about us, who we are. I prepared this as a volunteer, part of Five Hive. We do a bunch of resources and also plan out review sessions like these. If you want to join, check out this document. Slides will be included, so you can check out the link there. This is also the feedback for this lecture. I'm putting this here so that you guys have access to it. For now, you can just take the QR code, scan the QR code, or put in the survey link. I'll leave it up for a little bit, like 5 seconds. Cool. By the way, this QR code will be back, and also the link will also be back at the end of the lecture. Disclaimer, once again, AP is a trademark with College Board. They are not affiliated with us. They do not endorse us because we're not part of College Board, right? Another disclaimer I have to issue is that there's period language in this unit. That is to say, language that we don't use anymore, and not in the fact that it is archaic language that would sound very Shakespearean or whatever. There are some offensive words, and specifically the word I'm talking about is the N-word. Back then, Americans, or just colonists in general, referred to African slaves as to the N-word. Not the modern N-word, but it is quite similar to the modern N-word. I don't think I will mention it at one point in the lecture, but I will give you guys a warning if I do mention it. Of course, we don't condone the usage of this language at all. The only appropriate time is in academic writing, but we also don't recommend using it while taking the exam. Here are some expectations, the same as before. Please be respectful. This lecture is being recorded, so you don't want to be recorded being mean to everyone else. Try to be engaged as much as possible. I will try to ask questions at the end of every topic. If I haven't seen your question, bump it. That is to say, just repost it. When I do ask, oh, are there any questions? Um, and if you do have to go, I understand that I started this 15 minutes later than I initially planned to. I apologize about that once again. Don't feel obligated to just stay because, again, there's going to be a recording for that. And today's agenda is a little bit more packed than before. You might have noticed that I included some more stuff such as practice questions. Some of you guys said that a bit of practice would be nice, so I included more MCQs and analysis and an SAQ at the end, and we will take a look at the CED as well, or summarize the CED points. Okay, any questions about the agenda and everything? Okay. If there aren't any questions about anything, let's jump into the content. There's not that many people on the lecture, so hopefully they will watch. So 2.2, again, we're skipping 2.1 and 2.8, I think is the last topic. Yes. 2.2 is about European colonization, which seems rather redundant because we kind of talked about at least one European state that did colonization in the first unit, and that is the Spanish. So just a general review of how the Spanish kind of did their things. They were pretty brutal. They were suppressive, especially with Native Americans and African slaves. Why? Well, they adopted a system of encomienda, right? This is a system where we had Spanish encomenderos who were entrusted to convert Native Americans, but really what it is that they just brutally subjugated Native Americans to hard labor while there was a bunch of disease rolling around. Right, and I've again included a picture of the mines of Potosi, an example of this. Another thing was that there were Spanish missions, basically kind of these complexes for missionaries to force conversion on Native Americans, right? And most of the times they used violence, like, do you like your hands? No, you lose your hands because you are not a Christian. That seems to be a recurrent theme with Christians. And finally, they had the casta system, basically a racial hierarchy that was enforced throughout. It became more complex as more intermarrying occurred. And basically, the Spanish were on top, or people of Spanish descent, for the most part, were on top. Anyone who had any trace of indigenous or African heritage were usually on the bottom. So that's hopefully review. Some of you guys remember that from Unit 1. But we have to talk about the French, the Dutch, and the English. And we'll go into more depth about the English in 2.3. So, what did the French do in the New World? Well, I should start off with they are Catholic, even to this day. For the most part, the French didn't really play a huge interventionist, so to speak, role with the natives. In fact, they maintained relatively good relations with natives. They did not really try to enforce conversion to the same magnitude as that of the Spanish, and they were mainly interested in fur trade. Examples of explorers that came to engage in fur trade include Samuel de Champlain. But another effect of the fur trade also involved alliances, and we will go back to the point of alliances in a future topic, I believe 2.5. What the French did was that they allied themselves with the Algonquian and the Huron in the Beaver Wars. Why? Well, they mainly traded fur with the Algonquian and the Huron. And one of the expectations of the natives' part was that the French would support them in some ways. So, what they would do is that they would participate in a war we call the Beaver Wars, which is oddly silly. But basically, this was a war between the Algonquian, Huron, and the Iroquois. As you might imagine, the Iroquois would ally with the English. But in this point in time, kind of the French were kind of the only ones at this point in time, that being before Jamestown, where a European state or a European colonist would work with a Native American in a military conflict. Ultimately, the Beaver Wars would end with a Great Peace of Montreal. So another form of diplomacy between Native Americans and European colonists. The Iroquois were not eradicated in the Beaver Wars. as you might know already from Unit 3. They are still relevant. Um, so, yeah. So, big takeaways with the French: good relationships with natives, mainly there for fur trade. Okay? Moving on to the Dutch. The Dutch were not Catholics. In fact, they were Calvinists. But they were also interested in fur trading. The main colony that the Dutch settled, New Netherlands or New Amsterdam, New Amsterdam being New York, was kind of an outpost for fur trading. The way the Dutch approached colonization was with commercial leadership. And what do I mean by that? I mean, they employed corporations or joint stock companies such as the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company to explore and establish settlements. The reason why I actually bring up the Calvinist point for the Dutch is that there's this kind of religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. And the Dutch were engaged in a conflict with the Spanish. Why? Because actually the Netherlands were Spanish before. They were a Spanish holding, but since they converted to Calvinism for the most part, they wanted to break free. And so what happened after that was an 80 Years' War. Whether or not the war exactly happened in 80 years, that's not important. But you do need to know that there was a kind of conflict between Calvinists, or Protestants in general, and Catholics, as they will be relevant later, much more later, in 2.6 and 2.7. The Dutch will end up losing their holds in the Americas to the English. New Amsterdam or the New Netherlands were taken by the English in the future, and it would become New York. After losing New Amsterdam, the Dutch will focus mainly on the Dutch East Indies, that being modern-day Indonesia. And they will hold on to that for a very long time. Let's move on to the English. The English were not very hyper-focused on colonizing the Americas at first. Why? They had a bunch of conflicts back home. I mentioned the 80 Years' War. Well, that included the Anglo-Spanish War. Again, this conflict between Protestants and Catholics. At the same time, one of their focuses was Ireland. I could go on a whole tangent about Ireland in respect to British history, but this is not British history. This is U.S. history. The first attempt at colonization, hopefully you guys remember, is the lost colony of Roanoke. It was a failure. Why? Because they kind of disappeared. But eventually the English will come back to settle their own colonies, not for this, not for like a uniform reason, right? And we will come to find out all the reasons why colonists settled in the British colonies in 2.3. But before I go on, are there any questions about 2.1? I will not get into the conspiracy theories with Roanoke because it's not entirely relevant to the whole thing. What were conflicts back home for England? So the Anglo-Spanish War, they had oh, I forgot to mention the English Navy and Spanish Armada. So the Spanish Armada and the English Navy were engaged in multiple battles as a result of the Anglo-Spanish War. The English supported the Dutch. I forgot to include that context. Thank you for reminding me that. So that's what that depiction is all about. So the guy who ran, did he just come back and... Yeah, that's what happened in Roanoke. But let's ignore Roanoke because it's not entirely important, even though it's fascinating. I had a burrito. Anyways, okay. So if there are no more questions, we can move on to 2.3. If you had any questions, I apologize, but we got to keep on going. So we got to know about all the regions of British colonies. So I've listed them here. New England, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies, and the West Indies. At least the English colonies in the Americas, right? So let's walk through New England. So New England is New England was made up of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. Maine was not a territory until much later, and we'll get into that in Unit 5. The principal idea with the settlement of New England was that it was first settled by Puritans, people who wanted to make the Church of England pure. They were very strict Christians. They were very disciplined, and they saw that the Church of England was not being pure in their eyes. They were not following the word of God directly and all that. Their conflict with the Anglican Church is going to lead to some kind of suppression or some kind of alienation in the British mainland. So, religious freedom is going to be one of their, or the freedom to practice their religion or their beliefs as a whole, is going to motivate them to settle in New England. What did they do once they settle in New England? Well, they mainly developed small towns and family farms. I don't know why I started going to accent there, but small communities. They were they were trying their best to be self-sufficient as much as possible. So their labor or workforce was homegrown. They had a very strict work ethic, right? The phrase that idleness is the devil's work is kind of the idea. You got to keep on working. You got to do something. You got to, do your own stuff. So they did a combination of a variety of industry, quote unquote, for their economy. So they did agriculture, right, for self-sufficiency, but they also engaged in a bit of commerce. But the commerce would not involve any agricultural products or cash crops. The main reason why is that New England wouldn't be particularly prime for any kind of plantation economies. And for the most part, they focused on the shipping industry and shipbuilding because they had a lot of lumber. Another thing you should know about New England colonies or the New Englanders is that they were, again, very religious to the point that they believed themselves to be religiously important. Like they were a city upon a hill, something that other people around them should look up to become this pedestal, this manifestation of Christianity or whatever. So this part of the British colonies was relatively centered on conversion, mainly of Native Americans. And I included the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, mainly because they did practice some kind of forced conversion on Native Americans. They would establish these kinds of praying towns for Native Americans. In addition, they were pretty strict on themselves. Examples of famous colonists who were kind of exiled or banished from Puritan settlements were Roger Williams, who would go on to found Rhode Island, and Anne Hutchinson, who would go on to be killed, her entire family. Examples of New England colonies that you should know are Plymouth, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the New Haven Colony, which is in Connecticut. Let's move on to the middle colonies. The middle colonies is a little bit tricky. They are New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Now, a lot of students tend to trip up with the middle colonies because they're in the middle and not many people know what they're really known for. So I'm going to clear things up. They were economic and urban centers, right? New York City, Philadelphia, big cities. Mainly those two. Boston is a big city as well, but that's partly because of shipbuilding and the shipping industry there. They also had diverse populations. They had quite a bit of diversity, mainly due to religious tolerance, and we'll get into that. But first, I want to talk about New York. As I mentioned before, New York was New Amsterdam transformed into English colonies. And part of the transfer from New Amsterdam to New York involved an agreement that the English would respect the many ethnic communities that already existed in the Dutch colony. The handover of New Amsterdam, you don't really need to know how New Amsterdam became New York, but the handover of New Amsterdam was peaceful. The Dutch just gave it up. There was no war involving that, right? They're both Protestants. So that's it about New York. You should know that New York City is obviously a huge urban center. Pennsylvania is going to be another important colony, mainly because that it was founded by a Quaker, William Penn. Shocking, I know. William Penn was a Quaker, and he wanted to establish a colony based on Quaker principles that depended on, everyone is equal. Um, and he really emphasized religious freedom, unlike the Puritans when the Puritans actually made it to New England. Um, that's pretty much it about the middle colonies. Is that they were economic urban centers, and they kind of varied in population. They were diverse, religiously and ethnically diverse. Okay, let's move on to the southern colonies. I'm going to actually group this with the West Indies because they're both pretty similar. Both regions were plantation economies. They grew cash crops. So for Chesapeake, that is Virginia and Maryland, they mainly grew tobacco. For the Carolinas and Georgia, they mainly grew rice and indigo. At first, they will become cotton. They will transfer to the cotton economy, but that is much, much later. Later down into Unit 4 and Unit 5. West Indies mainly focused on sugar because you could grow sugar cane easily, much like the other West Indies colonies owned by the Spanish and the French. So let's talk about Chesapeake. Chesapeake was initially, first saw Jamestown, which was initially established with the intent of finding gold and silver, much like the Spanish. However, they did not find gold and silver. In fact, a lot of them starved to death. But eventually they realized that tobacco would be profitable because Europeans developed an addiction to tobacco. After that, another colony that would be started would be Maryland in the Chesapeake, right? Initially, Maryland was Catholic dominated, and when I say Catholic dominated, I mean it was ruled by Catholics, but the majority were Protestants. It would later transform into majority Protestant colony, majority Protestant ruled, and they would also farm tobacco. The Carolinas, you don't really need to know how the Carolinas were founded, just know that they were a plantation economy, and for them, they mainly focused on rice and indigo. That's it. For the West Indies, you also just need to know that they were sugar plantations. Now, the thing you do need to know about the southern colonies in the West Indies are labor. Initially in the Chesapeake, we had indentured servitude. What indentured servitude was that people would voluntarily give up their freedoms to travel over there to the Americas. And part of their contract was being a servant. It was basically temporary quote-unquote slavery, except most indentured servants would die before the end of their contract. If they managed to complete their contract, they would get a piece of land and settle. But again, it was not entirely common, and indentured servants were rather educated. They did have some kind of power in terms of race, and we'll go into that much later, into more detail when we talk about Bacon's Rebellion. But eventually, the Chesapeake will become the labor system in Chesapeake will transform into chattel slavery due to a variety of reasons, and I mentioned Bacon's Rebellion. We'll go into that a little bit more. The rest of the colonies, though, the Carolinas, Georgia, and the West Indies, relied on chattel slavery. Chattel slavery mainly supplied by African slaves from the slave trade. Another thing College Board wants you to know about is African culture. How did African slaves preserve their culture? Mainly preserving their own traditions, such as dances and singing, and Gola culture. We'll talk about slavery in the British colonies in more depth, and we will talk a little bit more about Gullah and Vodun as well. Finally, you should know that these British colonies were not directly ruled by their mother country. The reason why is, there's an entire ocean separating the colonies and the British. And so what eventually would happen is that the colonies would establish their own institutions, some of them even democratic. Probably the most popular example of a democratic institution for the colonies would be the House of Burgesses in Virginia, which were it's an example of elected assembly. Another example you might also know is that the Mayflower Compact established a democratic means of consent to decision. New England had congregational churches where colonists will meet up and discuss and matters regarding the town. They would also have an elected governor, and again, the principle of consent to decision was one of the key democratic principles that would be very important in establishing the Constitution. Another thing a caveat I should mention about the elected assemblies, specifically in the South, they were mainly dominated by rich planters. So yeah, educated and rich planters. Any questions about 2.3 so far? We have a little bit. Actually, I should have moved on to here. Forms of labor. That was the second slide. Sorry. Patrick Henry and House of Burgesses is a depiction of Patrick Henry was elected to the House of Burgesses. Pilgrims going to church is a depiction of pilgrims going down to... Democracy wasn't established yet, but they have democratic institutions. Institutions that had some democratic principles involved. Basically, the idea is self-government. Any other good questions? That's a good question. If not, I will not be an indentured servant. If not, let's move on quickly to 2. No, not 2.4. I forgot. We have analysis. So here's an analysis by elected speaker from House of Burgesses. This was in the CED. So I'll give you guys maybe 5 minutes. Don't need to write too many sentences. Maybe a one-liner should be enough. 5 minutes sounds good for you guys? Or maybe 8 minutes. 5 minutes? Okay, I'll give you guys 5 minutes. How did Queen Elizabeth I contribute to the whole Britain and American colonies thing? Good question. She didn't really... What's a good way of wording this? The role she plays isn't very direct. To some extent, the monarchy, that being Queen Elizabeth, right, contributes to the establishment of colonies is not significant for the most part. But if you do want to know some context behind the politics of England and how it impacted the colonies, because that can come up. It isn't outlined in the CED. You might want to know about the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. What happened with the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution is that turmoil in England will kind of distract the English from their kind of main authority over the colonies. And so... that leads to salutary neglect. But as for the monarchy and establishing colonies and all that, you don't really need to know a whole lot about it. I know that didn't directly answer your question, mainly because it's just not something you really should know, and I don't want to give anyone too much to study for, if it's not going to be a big point on the exam. You guys have 3 minutes left if you are also still doing the analysis exercise. I'm seeing responses rolling in. We will stop. We will read through these responses at 5:47. We want to move through this quickly. Apologize for the people in the recording. Okay, thank you, trombonist. Okay, it's 5:47. Let's regroup to read trombonist, and I'm assuming pineapple juice is okay with me for that. So, A, he emphasized wishing to make the rules of proceedings interest, possibly not interested in a monarchical ruling. So, close. What John Randolph is saying. Hold on. Yeah. So, what John Randolph is saying, particularly in respect to democratic principle, is consent of governed, and to not transfer things into personal interests. Possibly not interested in a monarchical ruling is a little bit awkward. So, actually, would you like to clarify that? What you exactly meant? I'll give you some time to respond because. Yeah, the principle of self-government and consent of the governed was kind of the big point he worked on. B, if I shall be found unable to perform what it will be my duty to dictate to others. That's a good quote. I was hoping more for of an explicit description. We'll move on to part C. A historian might use this in the context of how checks and balances works in the United States as well as a democratic society as a whole. I would say a historian might use this source as self-government being the beginning of democratic principles, kind of colonists kind of warming up to democratic ideals, which you are kind of pointing at, democratic society as a whole. Let's read through Pineapple Juice's response. Accountability and rule of law, he emphasizes that public officials must follow the established rules and not use their position for personal gain. That's good. He sees abuse of power as allowing personal feelings, ambitions, or influence over others to interfere with one's official's duties. So that's something similar Trombonist pointed out, right? That was good. Yeah, the key point was about self-government. 3, to illustrate colonial attitudes toward leadership, governance, and public service in 18th century Virginia. I would specifically, I want to probe this. Specifically, what kind of attitudes? Governance and leadership. What about that? Oh, are they not? Because the reason why I want to probe into this is that when you get a question, how might a historian use this source? I'm really asking you, can you imagine using this source in an argument, in a concrete argument? So, how self-governance was developing? Yeah. I think we'll refer back to the trombone as the idea of kind of warming up to democratic institutions. I think we will get this point more solid as we talk about 2.7 colonial sentiments about freedoms. But we also want to think about self-rule governance being the one thing colonists love a lot. But all of you guys hit on pretty good points, so I'm pretty satisfied with all that. Okay, 2.4 is on the transatlantic trade. So this is where triangular trade actually comes in. I remember last lecture we were someone asked a question about the difference between the Columbian Exchange and the triangular trade. This is what the triangular trade is: transatlantic trade. So what is the triangular trade? Well, the triangular trade describes a phenomenon of relationships between America, Europe, and Africa in terms of goods. So, what did the what kinds of things did they send to each other? So for America, they sent raw goods principally to Europe. What Europe would do is that they would take those good resources and use them for manufacturing to produce finished goods. And what Europe would do then was send those goods back to the Americas. The Americas would be the market for that goods. As for Africa, they would send slaves. That's about it. Key idea with the triangular trade is that this is an illustration of mercantilist policies. What would that exactly mean? Well, European states will want to have more exports than imports, right? One way to do that is to make sure that you have cheap raw resources, often using cheap labor, aka slaves, to have more resources to send back to Europe, and to principally send those goods not only back to the America, but to have a lot of goods to sell in Europe itself, right? And some raw goods that you should know that the Americas produced: the West Indies, I already mentioned sugar. Carolinas worked on rice and indigo. The Chesapeake, mainly tobacco. And the middle colonies produced some foodstuffs such as grains. So mainly the southern colonies sent back raw resources for the most part. Another thing that College Board wants you to know is the impact that transatlantic trade had on natives. Well, part of the trade included horses. And when horses arrived in the Americas, they proved to be quite important in the lives of Plains Native Americans. The Native Americans in the Plains will start to use horses in part of their daily lives for hunting as well for warfare. Another thing about warfare is that Europeans sold guns to natives. And kind of selling those guns led to competition among natives. More natives wanted to trade fur. And so this kind of led to even more conflict, more amplified conflict between natives. And during these conflicts, some European traders were expected to pick sides. And for the French, they picked the Algonquian and the Huron side. And for the English, they picked the Iroquois side. Another thing is that the competition among Native Americans also pushed them to overhunt beavers, to the point that beavers were nearly extinct, and also to the point that encroachment was a regular thing, whether or not it be Native Americans or whether or not it be colonists doing the encroachment as well. And finally, another point that came back from Unit 1, which is very important, as you can tell, epidemics among natives led to decimated populations. And one of the reactions that natives would do, which is another form of conflict, would be the mourning wars. What mourning wars were was a way to kind of preserve and maintain communities. So when a Native American society would experience a large death toll due to disease, They would wage war on other colonies, Native Americans, not on other colonies, on other Native Americans, and take them in to replace dead members, which is a little messed up. Um, Transatlantic trade also implied relationships between the colonies and the motherland. So you should know that the British did try to exert control, even though they were distracted by a bunch of wars back home in Europe. And one of the attempts at control would be the Navigation Acts. So what did the Navigation Acts really do? By the way, they started in 1651, if you're curious. Well, they dictated that, only English ships can go into the American colonies. Only goods should only be sent to England. Only England. England is important. England's the only thing you need. Another thing they also did was they increased customs duties. And if you don't know what customs duties are, they are tariffs. Gotta love the tariffs debate. And so what really essentially happens is that in an attempt to really profit off of the colonies, the main British state would pass these navigation acts much to the detriment of merchants, manufacturers, and artisans. Pretty much ordinary colonists. Well, colonists who, the majority of colonists in these in this time. Eventually, though, the British will come to kind of enforce these navigation acts in very lax ways. And what I say is that sometimes they will enforce and other times they'll turn a blind eye, and this turning of the blind eye we'll call salutary neglect. But in the instances where they enforced the navigation acts, colonists will retaliate. And examples of these retaliations will include Bacon's Rebellion and the Boston Revolt of 1689. Their attempt to add the governor's attempt in Boston at enforcing the navigation acts will actually lead to the colonists to straight up choose violence and kick him out. They won't end up killing him, though. Bacon's Rebellion, well, there's a variety of reasons. Involve navigation acts, but it will also involve disagreements over policies on indigenous peoples. And we will talk about the implications of Bacon's Rebellion much later in 2.7 and 2.6. But before we get to 2.5, there's an MCQ actually. Before we get to that MCQ, are there any questions on 2.4? Would this connect to the Columbian exchange? Not exactly. Colombian trade system is not exactly a real trade kind of thing. It's more of it's more of people just bringing stuff to other and not involving the transaction, or some sort of transaction. As for the intolerable acts, that's much later. That is in Unit 3. Yeah, spoiler. Can you quickly explain the Spanish Indian War? What do you exactly mean by that? Do you mean by Spanish Indian War? Conflicts between the Spanish and the Indians? French Indian would make more sense. French Indian War is in Unit 3. So if you can wait for that, that will be tomorrow. I'll reserve that question for that, and hopefully that will be clarified. Then something else for navigation acts. What was that other thing? Could you clarify your question? What was that other thing? I don't quite understand. While they're typing, I will show you guys this MCQ. And I'll give you guys 3 minutes to look at it. They stopped typing though. I heard you say there was Bacon Rebellion and some... Oh, yes, there was a second rebellion illustrative of conflicts between colonists and the British. The Boston Revolt in 1689. Yes, 1689. Boston Revolt. The context of that directly involves the Navigation Acts. They tried to enforce the Navigation Acts, but the colonists will say, nope, your stupid Navigation Acts are cringe. And we're going to kick you out of your position of power. Anyways, take a look at this MCQ, and after this, we will actually take a little break. And when I say little break, I accidentally did not click on tell everyone to start, so that's why there's not many people here. You guys are already starting to answer, so I guess we'll take that break soon. And we will pick off from where do we leave off? And we'll pick up from 2.5 when I restart and when everyone gets notified. I'm sorry about that for everyone. So, the colonists will respond to the Navigation Acts. The British will also respond to the colonies responding to the Navigation Acts, mainly by thinking, screw it. We'll just not do this. Yes, as pineapple juice is both. Yes, for the Boston Revolt. The British will respond to that. They will respond to it by being a little bit more lax. And I'm seeing everyone's responses is going with D. Native Americans exchanged fur for weapons, which intensified conflicts in the Northeast. Would anyone care to explain why they picked choice D? Process of elimination. That's a valid explanation. Competition. Yes. You can see a weapon in the image. Yeah, so that's the point I was talking about. Conflicts between Native Americans in the Northeast will be frequent. So it looks like all of you guys understood that point. We will take a very short break, and when I say very short break, probably will be less than 1 minute, just to make sure that everyone does get notified that the lecture is in fact happening. So yeah. That. Go share this window. There's certainly more people than last time. Okay. Yeah, I accidentally clicked the review thing. I think I might have actually pinged everyone. Did it? So let's see. Where did we leave off? Right. We left off with the MCQ1. Now we're going to move on down to 2.5. Before that, any questions for 2.2 through 2.4? That was our halfway mark. European colonization, the British colonies, as well as transatlantic trade. Have we passed the headright system? Um, did we? We might have. Oh, I forgot to mention it. Yes, the headright system. Basically, the headright system is kind of a way of getting people to migrate over here. We might touch on that even more in 2.7. Yes, there's a bit about migration to the colonies, but it's not entirely imperative for you guys to know. Yep. It's a way of incentivizing. All right. Well, if there are no questions, would the Anglo-Powhatan War be mentioned often in the AP exam? You will need to know that it is example of conflict between Native Americans and the colonists, which is actually the subject of 2.5, as you can see here. So with that said, I guess we will segue into that. So, 3 points you need to know about such interactions between American Indians and colonists. Some of them formed alliances. Some of them killed each other. And the third point, which is quite interesting, this is the only time that College Board explicitly mentions an event, being the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. New Spain made some concessions to the Native Americans. So let's start with the first point. This is a very short point, by the way. So what kinds of Native alliances were made? Well, we already touched on one. The French in the Beaver Wars. It's not exactly an alliance, but it's a form of accommodation, I should say, where the French will agree to support the Algonquian and the Huron against the Iroquois, right? Well, I also mentioned the British and the Iroquois. This kind of alliance we will call the covenant chain. Do you need to know that it's called the covenant chain? No, you just need to know that the British and the Iroquois will have agreements more often than the Powhatans and the actual colonists. That's really about it. Native alliances will not last very long, mainly due to encroachment conflicts regarding land resources between the colonists and the Native Americans. So some examples of military conflict or conflict between natives and colonists. Someone mentioned the Powhatans and the Anglo-Powhatan War. Yes, the war in 1622 where the Powhatans will attack Jamestown. I included a depiction of that. Very gnarly. But also other examples of wars that you should know are the Pequot War, as well as Metacom's War. Metacom's War in 1675 is going to be more important than the Pequot War, by the way. Basically, the Pequot War broke out in New England because, again, the encroachment on territories led to general mistrust between the natives and the colonists, and eventually the natives will kill an English merchant. And so what the colonists will do is, well, an eye for an eye, and they will respond to that with violence. So that's about it with military conflict. The only fact you really need to know in terms of general developments is that kind of conflicts with land, resources, and territories will escalate into straight-on wars, and very frequent wars. Now, the last form of conflict is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. This is a pretty important revolt because this is a response to the encomienda system, forced conversion, labor, as well as a third factor, rivalry between other Native American tribes and raids that would frequently occur against the Pueblo settlement or the Santa Fe settlement, which was the kind of the base of operations for encomienda against the Pueblo. So what the Pueblo will do is violence. And while they successfully take over Santa Fe, the Spanish will come back and take it back. So the Pueblo uprising will fail, but the Spanish will learn from this. So what they will do is they will actually be more lax with the encomienda system. So this is the decline of encomienda system. In addition, intermarrying will be a little bit more accepted, and we'll see the rise of, again, intermarriage, but also the rise of new Mexican culture, as well as kind of religious syncretism. So instead of Pueblos being fully forced, or natives in general being fully forced to adopt Christianity, what they will do is they will adopt some parts, and most missions will think, I guess. So that's one thing you should know. This also kind of marks the beginning of kind of the decreased presence of New Spain in the colonies, as well. And also the decline of Spanish grip over New Spain. Any questions about 2.5? It's a pretty tiny topic. What happened with the Pueblo revolt? So they do take Santa Fe, but a variety but a variety of factors such as weather and starvation, and other kinds of factors that would lead to a decline in population will eventually give the Spanish the opportunity to take back Santa Fe, and that's the effective end of the Pueblo revolt. It's also known as the Pueblo Uprising. Both mean the same thing. Yes, the Spanish will take back Santa Fe from the Pueblo. Any more questions on 2.5? It's not entirely paramount, but I want to make sure I want to clarify everything. No? Alright. We're going to move on. Oh, someone asked a question. Was the French and Dutch involved in this? In the Pueblo revolt? Or involved in the topic? In the topic, yes. They appear, well, specifically the French, not the Dutch. The French appear in alliances. You should know that the French supported Algonquian and Huron tribes in the Beaver Wars, which is a point I already made in 2.2, but I want to reiterate it here. One of the things about this, about lecturing in APUSH, is that I will be mentioning a lot of stuff in future topics, and I will also be mentioning stuff in past topics throughout these lectures, which is the complicated part of APUSH in general. Okay, I will let you finish your thought, and then we'll move on after this. Anglo and Powhatan means only the Anglo English and the Powhatan natives. Yes. Okay. Let's move on to 2.6, slavery in the British colonies. This is a big one. But I'm not going to talk, I'm not going to go full AP African American on this. So let's talk about labor in the Americas, specifically the rise of slavery. Why do we see the rise of slavery? Well, I mentioned Bacon's Rebellion. And what Bacon's Rebellion comprised of, for the most part, were indentured servants. Why indentured servants? And so what would happen is that Virginia will realize, oh, these indentured servants, guys, you don't really want to mess with them when they all want to kill you or want to overthrow you. So one of the things they will do is kind of turn to chattel slavery. They're going to join the rest of the southern colonies. So that's a trend in the Chesapeake. As for slavery in the colonies itself, you should know that New England did not use enslaved Africans a lot. Why? Family farms. A family is enough. It's self-sufficient. We don't really need to grow these crops to sell. If we get a surplus, that's great for us. We can just sell it on the market and earn some money. The only part where you see a major slave population will be in major ports such as Boston. Major ports also such as New York. And the main point of slaves in these ports were to mainly do menial labor, such as carry things around, board ships, and all that. Now, where we see a lot of slaves are going to be in the West Indies and the South, and the Chesapeake, which is also part of the South, mainly because of plantation economies. When you want to grow a lot of crops, you need a lot of people to harvest the crops and to process the crops so that they can be shippable to other places. Part of that job is very daunting. It is very tiresome, and if you know anything about the English, they're not all about that. But when they have African slaves, well, they can just invest some money, pay money to get these slaves, and then use these slaves to get these crops. Profit. They get cash crops. They profit off of slavery. However, since we see a lot of slaves, a very sharp increase, so much so that slaves will make up a very huge amount of the southern population, what these colonies, specifically the southern colonies, are going to do is establish slave codes, a series of laws that would try to diminish the status of slaves and keep them in slavery. So, and the justification for these slave codes were mainly to establish dominance, to justify slavery, and to make sure that slaves would not rise up in any kind of social fashion or political fashion. So, some things you should know about slaves is that the status of the slave would always follow the mother. So essentially what that means is that if your mother was a slave, you're a slave. And so, the majority of slaves will remain in slavery because of this key point. An example of a law that illustrates this is called the Maryland Anti-Amalgamation Law. Basically, anti-amalgamation laws dictate that, hey, if your mother's a slave, you're a slave. Sorry. Well, they're not sorry. However, not however, it doesn't get any better. Another thing about slavery is that conversion to Christianity doesn't mean you're a free person. You're still a slave. In fact, many slaves would not achieve freedom in any kind of way except for running away or, just mainly running away or leaving the colonies in a way that they could escape. That's about it. So yes, Christians would own other Christians as slaves. That's not really Christian of them, but they didn't really care about that. Another thing is that they really didn't want interracial marriage. They made it pretty much illegitimate. Another example of a legislation that would illustrate this point would be the Virginia Anti-Marriage Law of 1691, which is a very strange way of titling it Virginia. But basically, outside of marriage, if you were caught as a woman having a relationship, a fling, so to speak, with a slave, you might be severely punished. And if you remember, status followed mother. So this was just a surefire way of keeping slaves in slavery. If you do want to see like a whole slave code, I would recommend going into the New York Slave Code, which was passed in 1702. There's a variety of slave codes that you can read through. And they all pretty much follow the same thing. They prohibited gatherings. They prevented slaves from owning weapons, just so that slaves would not have a good opportunity to rise up against these planters, or even rise up in status as well. Now, Slaves they didn't just accept this, right? If you were inflicted with these kinds of things, you would not be okay with it. So what they will do is they will resist in two ways: overt or covert, violence or culture. So let's talk about the violence first, because there's quite a few explicit details in there. The first example that I included is the Stono Rebellion, which took place in South Carolina, 1739. Stono Rebellion was an attempt of a lot of African slaves to kind of flee from South Carolina to, strangely enough, to Spanish Florida. Why? Well, they actually, in Spanish Florida, they had a higher chance of becoming freed and kind of having their own life. And that attracted a lot of slaves. Obviously, the English are not a fan of that. And so what they will do is that they will plan a rebellion and try to kill as many white planters as possible and make it down to Spanish Florida. They would not succeed. The rebellion was put down, a lot of them executed. And South Carolina will react to this, much like Virginia reacted to Bacon's rebellion, by passing a certain act. And this is the part where I have to use a relatively offensive word. I made this disclaimer at the beginning, but if you don't know, there's period language, and it's unacceptable to use this language now today. The N-word Act of 1740. N-word being Negro, not the modern N-word. Basically, this act will be quite similar to slave codes. They will prohibit gatherings. They will prohibit slaves getting armed. There was a general mistrust. After the Stono Rebellion, here's another example of quote-unquote violence, there'll be a lot of mass hysteria in New York, mainly due to fires, random fires. And these New Yorkers are actually going to blame African slaves and as well as Catholics. And they will hold a series of trials called the New York Conspiracy Trials in 1741, which will lead to the execution of a handful of people. But another thing you should know is that this just didn't happen in the South. It also happened in the West Indies, specifically the Maroon Wars, the first and the second Maroon Wars. Basically, these Maroon Wars were a series of conflict between guerrilla Maroons and native Jamaicans and the British authorities. As for cultural resistance, I mentioned Gullah. Gullah culture is it's a little tricky to explain, but in an oversimplified fashion, basically it's a culture of West African traditions, but preserved. What makes it different from actual West African traditions is the fact that they did it in their own plantations and they were adapted to their conditions. They will sing spirituals, and eventually these spirituals will transform into blues and they became ways for African slaves and African American slaves to kind of deal with their conditions. Another thing you should know is that they actually bonded very well. They bonded and gave each other names. Names were actually quite meaningful for African slaves. Family was also quite meaningful because family members were often separated at slave auctions. So even though this is kind of covert resistance, they also kind of broke tools, pretended to be sick, right? The usual thing that you will learn in Unit 4 and Unit 5. Any questions about slavery in the British colonies, though, so far? What were the trials between Catholics, Africans, and West Indies? Oh, I might have went a little too fast with that. Sorry. So the trials involving Catholics and Africans were the New York Conspiracy Trials in 1741. That was an effect of the Stono Rebellion because they believed that there were conspirators who were going to have a full-scale uprising in New York. And they believed that it was Africans and Catholics who were perpetuating that. That's what the New York Conspiracy Trials are. The reason why it's included in the CED as an optional source is that it's actually an effect of the Stono Rebellion. They don't make that clear, actually. Basically mass hysteria like the Salem witch trials, which we did not mention, but we might mention it later. The West Indies is the Maroon Wars. Basically, escaped African slaves will join arms with native Jamaicans and will wage guerrilla warfare against the British colonists, specifically the British authorities. Any more questions? So conversion to Christianity, that's a good question. Why did conversion not mean freedom? And why did African slaves bother to convert to Christianity in the first place? Um, so first part, right, the freedom part. Again, they just wanted to keep them in slavery. But why did African Americans choose to convert to Christianity? Part of it might have been a spiritual issue. Maybe another part was that um, sometimes these slave codes would also suppress the West African traditions. So in some ways, they would try to practice some kind of syncretism between Christianity and their own traditions. Sometimes they did fully convert to Christianity due to the fact that, well, they were brought to Christian churches, actually. There's actually an interesting niche here, was that English colonists did not sing very well, and we actually have journals about this. But English colonists found that African slaves were good at singing. And so sometimes these African slaves were brought into churches to be part of choirs, to be part of the chorales. Eventually, some of these African slaves will get into it, and some of them might eventually convert to Christianity. That is one little niche, but you don't need to know that. We will talk about Christianity's role among the African American community a little bit later, around Unit 4 and Unit 5. I think it's Unit 5. Someone is typing a thought, so I will let them finish it, and then we will move on to 2.7. Well, not necessarily, because the fact that you were a slave in the time kind of made you stand out, kind of. Well, to a certain extent, they weren't really citizens in the first place. They were just slaves. They were property. So citizens have some kind of property, but slaves were the property. So it's not exactly accurate to describe African slaves as second-class citizens, simply because they weren't viewed as citizens in the first place. Does that make sense? We will talk about second-class citizens, unfortunately, especially when we talk about Reconstruction. Okay. You did finish your thought, so I would promise you're going to go to 2.7. If you have any questions, I'm sorry, but we have to keep on going. So 2.7 is actually pretty heavy, mainly because it's a very good segue into Unit 3. So, things we need to talk about. Migration to North America. Why did people migrate to North America? Well, when we say migrate to North America, I'm mainly concerned with the British colonies, okay? We already know the reasons for people going to the French colonies is for fur trading. People going to Spain was money. And finally, we need to actually address people going to the British colonies. The first part about European emigration is that it was economically appealing. So, at first point, you initially had indentured servants, some vagabonds, some criminals who were being kind of either exiled or wanted to move to North America in hopes of better chances. Um, but sooner or later, we eventually see the development of an increase in professionals and craftsmen, people such as lawyers and printers and merchants, starting to settle in North America. And part of that reason is actually religious. Um, the British colonies primarily attracted Protestants. Why? Because the British were Protestants. And one of the appeals with the British colonies, well, these guys are Protestants. We will protect you guys from Catholic monsters and all that. So people who were attracted to the colonies include the Huguenots in France. If you know anything about the French at this time, they really hated Protestants. Um, so Huguenots will leave France and travel to the Americas. Another thing is that the Quakers will also settle there due to bias against them by the British. And we also mentioned the Puritans as well. Um, but we also see a lot of Germans come in. And this is not kind of part of the first wave immigration wave that involved Germans. But at the time, Germans found themselves living in the wrong places. Some Catholic Germans found themselves living in Protestant areas. Some Protestant Germans found themselves living in Catholic areas. And they're thinking, oh shoot, this is not a good look. So one of the things they will do is actually move over to the Americas. Both Catholics and Protestants kind of had a place in the Americas. Remember that Pennsylvania was very religiously tolerant. Maryland, not so much because it's mainly Protestant. But you'll see some Catholics in Maryland simply because it's just called Maryland. Not Queen Mary, as in Mary, the mother of Jesus, which is the difference between Catholics and Protestants. One of the key differences. And this will actually lead to our next point, diversity. We will actually see a religiously diverse population throughout the Americas. Throughout the British colonies, not the Americas. And what will eventually happen is we will see a lot of Protestant denominations. So not only we will see some Puritans, not only we will see some Anglican, people who will stick to the Anglican church, we will see some Presbyterians, we will see some Lutherans, some Calvinists. And if you know anything about Protestant denominations, there are too many of them. I don't know why they choose to make their trees complicated, but they did. The main fact, you don't need to memorize all the denominations, but just know that there were a lot of them that rose out of this period, mainly because, well, they were accepted. Religious tolerance was a pretty important feature of the British colonies. And actually, this kind of diverse population will bring the Enlightenment with them. Some Huguenots will bring Enlightenment because the French were really big on Enlightenment. So much so that French aristocrats sponsored philosophical discussions in French salons, which means living rooms in French. So some key points about the Enlightenment. We will not get into too much depth with this because it's very important in Unit 3, and there's no point in beating a dead horse then. Basically, key principles: rationalism, empiricism, progressivism, cosmopolitanism, and technically deism. Deism is a belief that Benjamin Franklin was really big on. But he was an enlightened thinker. So let's start with rationalism. Rationalism was basically the principle that humans could use their thinking, their thoughts, to make important decisions. Unlike, let's default to a religious text like the Bible. Empiricism was, you need to have evidence. You're given the burden of proof. We should observe things and make conclusions from those observations. Part of that comes from the scientific revolution. Progressivism is basically the belief in humanity's ability to progress as a result of its thinking and its abilities. Sort of quite humanist, actually. Cosmopolitanism is the belief that humans should think about their positions in the entire world. It shouldn't think about local, provincial, or selfish interests. And deism, well, it's the belief that God did create stuff, but after that he kind of clocked out. He doesn't care. We are kind of the people we are the ones who will take charge of our own destinies and all that. So, any questions on all the points I've made? Pennsylvania goes crazy with denial. Of course they do. Any questions so far, or am I good to move on? Because the next part is actually really heavy and a little tricky. I'm seeing that no one's is typing, so I'm just going to move on and then I'll ask questions again. Here. Okay. Now, I did mention religious diversity, but we also have to talk about the First Great Awakening, as opposed to the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s. So, I should talk about evangelicals and kind of a division among them. So, in the First Great Awakening, historians will see two groups: the Old Lights and the New Lights. The Old Lights are very strict Puritans, and they are going to believe in the idea of predestination. Only the elect will make it into God's kingdom. That's the idea of predestination. The New Lights believed in personal and experiential faith. Basically, they believed in a kind of halfway covenant. They also believed that faith should be for everyone. You shouldn't leave religion to that of the elect, because if you do that, well, some people are going to think, well, then what's the point of Christianity? And so we're going to get some of these sermons to try to bring people back to Christianity by saying, hey, Christianity is for everyone, not for the elect. Some of these examples of people who gave a lot of sermons: Jonathan Edwards. I included a pamphlet. Is that a pamphlet? Yes, pamphlet from Jonathan Edwards. If you do have the opportunity to read it, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, feel free to read that. It's kind of a weird text to read through. Another Protestant or evangelical preacher you should know is George Whitefield. Both of these guys pretty much preach the same thing as far as evangelism goes. Now we need to talk about Anglicization, which is a term that College Board wants you to know, I guess. So, in the British colonies, we actually see people try to remain British. I don't know why you want to do that. Mainly in the colonial gentry. And when I say colonial gentry, I mean the rich white guys. Basically, they modeled their behaviors on British etiquette. They wanted to live an aristocratic lifestyle. They wanted to be bougie. They wanted to display their wealth. They wanted to make sure that people knew, oh, we are on top. And part of the reasons why they kind of start spending a lot of stuff on portraits, on glamorous houses, on tea, for some reason, on kind of being British and buying British goods, was that they had commercial ties back to Britain, back to London. And so what the colonial gentry will kick off is something we call the Consumer Revolution. Now, this is not exactly consumerism. Don't conflate the two. Basically, the Consumer Revolution is a movement among the colonial gentry to purchase and consume, mainly goods from Britain. They wanted to display their wealth. And one of the ways that they did that was tea. Tea was really important among British people for whatever reason. Whether or not you had a fancy tea set, didn't matter. If you drank tea, you also buy tea, which is mildly expensive. That's cool. Another thing about the Consumer Revolution is that part of the consumption will involve press and publications. The colonial press will be very important in this time, and they play a huge role for the colonial gentry. Why? The colonial gentry can read. And when you're rich and all, you kind of need to occupy yourself. So what were they going to do? They're going to read newspapers. They're going to read novels. Stuff like Robinson Crusoe were novels that were published in the Americas. But another important part about the colonial press is not just the Consumer Revolution, but also the idea of freedom of speech. The colonists really loved their freedom of speech and press. Basically, they wanted to publish whatever they wanted. They wanted to say whatever they could say, and the main reason why is, well, publications are very valuable in the culture of the colonial gentry, also among merchants, which were part of the colonial gentry. Now, the British will try to suppress, quote unquote, they will try to mitigate or kind of calm down this freedom fervor with speech and press, which will end up in a series of libel cases. And the most famous libel case that College Board has asked teachers to mention is the trial of Zenger. John Zenger was one of the newspaper publishers, and he got sued in a libel case. This was in 1735. As you can tell, colonists didn't like that. And one of the more famous guys who kind of defended the freedom of speech of Zenger was Alexander Hamilton. Don't sing the musical, please. And the key point with the Zenger trial was actually, hey, you know, Alex or Hamilton, you might be right. And they agreed with Zenger. So Zenger won that libel case. And the whole significance with the Zenger trial was that, freedom of speech and the freedom of press was ultimately a preserved value among colonists. Any questions about colonial society and culture? Do not sing the musical, please. I see two people are typing, so once I see, what was the historical context of the Zenger trial? Basically, Zenger published something that British authorities didn't like, so they sued him for a libel case. At least that's off the top of my head. All you need to know for Zenger is that he said something that someone didn't like, sued for libel, and yeah, they wanted to make him pay money for that. At least that's how most libel cases go. Was that enough historical context? Okay, yeah. Good question. You should be able to know what the Zenger trial was all about if it did happen. You shouldn't just name drop things. Please ask me those kinds of questions, because name dropping things is not a great thing to do on the AP exam. So ask me for context, ask me for some details you think that might be important for maybe a DBQ or SAQ or LEQ. Well, explain what happened that led to the Zenger trial and explain the significance of the Zenger trial. That's usually kind of how you want to approach bringing up evidence. Because usually when you mention the context, and sometimes you might naturally explain its relevance, the context, in terms of sourcing to your argument. You see where I'm coming from? Salem witch trials was basically mass hysteria. Salem witch trials is a side effect of the strict Puritanism that was in New England. Did I say I would mention it in 2.7? It wasn't really relevant in 2.7. Should have mentioned it in 2.3. So yeah, all you really need to know about the Salem witch trials is mass hysteria occurred among the population of Salem as a side effect of, well, very strict Puritanism. People were really paranoid about that. Again, so much so that they kicked a lot of colonists out of their colonies. And some of those colonists died, like Anne Hutchinson. Speaking of, how do you not double dip or repeat yourself in DBQs and the LEQs? How do you not double dip in the same evidence? This would go on. This would be more appropriate in an exam tips lecture. But if you want to make sure that you don't double dip and you have your evidence organized, do an outline before you start writing on the sheet. Do an outline. Highlight your thesis. Highlight your main points and highlight what evidence you will use and maybe a brief explanation, very short. Okay. I have a second MCQ for this. Yeah, that's all the questions it looks like. So please attempt the following MCQ, which is about the role of press, which I just lectured on. I'll give you guys 1 minute, maybe, because you guys seem to be really fast with these MCQs. Which means at 6:47, feel free to put down your responses. It's the second MCQ, the thing that's currently up on the screen. All of you guys can see the MCQ, right? Okay, good. Now, here's a key thing. It says best doesn't mean all of these answers are really great. That's one of the pitfalls with College Board is that they write some MCQs that aren't exactly well written. Or there might be really tiny details. So, some of you guys are thinking A, some of you guys are thinking C. Feel free to put down your answer. It doesn't matter if you get it wrong, right or wrong. After all, this is a best claim. Part of it is a little subjective. And also, I would like to see more opinions of other people on what they think. So feel free to drop your answer in the chat, please. A majority of people so far are thinking A. Does anyone disagree with A? Thinking of D, A, or C? D would be your second pick, but it doesn't feel too right. Anyone else have a take on this? You're going to switch to D. So a mixture of A, C, and D. I see some people to... Someone is typing, and I'll let them finish, and then we will walk through it. D. Poor B. Well, at least no one picked B. B is not correct. Yeah. I may have written 2 distractors in this one. Okay. So, anyone who picked A, we're going to walk through A, C, and D. So anyone who picked A, would you like to explain why you picked A? This is a bit of a trickier MCQ, so let's walk through this step by step. By heavily publishing on cases such as Zenger is the part that's throwing you off. Well, yeah, the press can help spread dissent. I should have put in the period, 1607 to 1754. It feels like they're name dropping Zenger just to confuse us. Well, your doubt on Zenger is a good. Did they spread dissent fully? No, not necessarily. That's not what all the newspapers would do. They would eventually fill that role, right, in Unit 3. But we're only focused in Unit 2, and part of it is my fault because I forgot to include 1607 to 1754 in Period 2. And Emin, your thoughts on the second part, by heavily publishing on cases such as Zenger, that is actually the one thing that makes Part A not the best answer. So for those of you who picked A, do you understand why it's not necessarily the best answer? It's that second part. Right? So an MCQ tip, when you are facing tricky questions with very tricky distractors, you have to read the entire answer. If any little word or any little phrase makes the answer iffy, you might want to read through it again and read through the prompt again. So that second part, by heavily publishing on cases such as Zenger, is a little questionable, right? Was it really an efficient way for the press to spread dissent fully in this period? Not necessarily. So if you think not necessarily with your answer choice, chances are it might be a distractor. Anyone who picked C, would they like to explain why they picked choice C? Wealthy and literate, yeah, but you don't know about the Enlightenment. That is a true thing. I may have neglected to mention that the Enlightenment mainly perpetuated through the rich, right? Aristocrats had the time to philosophize. People who were able to philosophize typically were the wealthy, both in Europe and America. I think I may have neglected that. Part of it also included publications. So Enlightenment thinkers also published texts. Part of them were also published in the Americas. You aren't too sure if that was the main role of the press, though. That's a true statement. Maybe it isn't the main role of the press. You may be just assuming that Americans are too literate now. Well, the issue of literacy is an important one. Not a lot of Americans were educated in terms of literacy and a lot of stuff. In fact, not a lot of Americans could afford a wide range of publications. In fact, some news were kind of by ear, while the rest of the newspapers were purchased by merchants, people who could earn money in a more stable way. Next one does bring up a good point. Transatlantic print culture did help Enlightenment ideas. The wealthy could read them because they were literate. They could afford but they could afford an education in the first place. Education was very expensive at the time, by the way. In fact, the colleges that we think of, like Harvard and Yale, they were originally for ministers. And part of the things that ministers should be able to do is just read the Bible. I'm feeling convinced that Part C might be a better answer, but does anyone in Part D want to defend Part D, explain why Part D might be the better answer over Part C? The suppression of press by British authorities angered many colonists, leading them to consume more publications and newspapers in defiance. Is there any part of that choice that kind of makes you question it a little bit in terms of logic or argument and reasoning? You feel like that it doesn't directly answer the question. It's not the role to talk about suppression. Okay, so Insomnia and Emin are on a good point. It doesn't really directly answer the question. Being suppressed is not really a role. It is an effect, so to speak. And also that last part, leading them to consume more publication and newspapers in defiance, doesn't exactly make sense. How do you get more colonists who do not read to read publications? Sure, some people might do it out of spite. I would probably do it out of spite. But not everyone's going to do it out of spite. So that leaves us with Part C. Not Part C, Choice C. Can't do it out of spite if you aren't literate. That's very fair. Yeah. Are there any thoughts about the other choices that you might want to play devil's advocate for, maybe? Learn how to read out of spite. I see MC Man is typing, though. So maybe he has a thought. After this, we will move on to the final SAQ, which is not really an SAQ. It's just a long form SAQ that I made longer because I felt like it. Oh, feedback. I do want to take a moment to apologize to everyone with the delay with this lecture. Unfortunately, traffic is not a good thing in LA, and I don't have any excuse. It's not a valid excuse. So yeah. Yeah, SoCal traffic is a nightmare. I thought I would be back in time to start the lecture at 5, but unfortunately, traffic accidents. Anyways, let's move on from the MCQ to this very weird 5-part SAQ. It's okay. This lecture is being recorded as always, and I have a feeling that most people were not aware that I moved the lecture back, or weren't even aware that the lecture was still happening, mainly because I forgot to ping everyone. So I apologize for that again. So for those of you who did not receive the ping and are here because of the ping in the middle of the day, I apologize. Because I forgot to click that. I don't know why, but for me it's off by default. Anyways, please attempt the following SAQ. Try to follow T, but you don't really have to. Because it is a 5-part SAQ, and usually you just have 3-part SAQs. The purpose of this SAQ is to hit on most of the points, most of the topics in Unit 2. Yes, there is an events button to see kind of the scheduling for the lectures. I will give you guys. Does 8 minutes sound enough? I don't know if you guys. No, because there's a lot of explain. Let's go with 10 minutes. I don't want to put you guys in under any pressure. Yeah, I decided to add all the APER sessions in advance. Although I will admit, this unit was not exactly going well because there's not a lot of good events to pick up from. So I do apologize for the decline in quality of this lecture because part of it involves the lack of transparency from College Board being vague. I should have put in more time for research, but past is the past. I'll cook in Unit 3 though. I did forget to tell you guys, we will reconvene at 7:10. For those of you who are working on this SIQ, feel free to just type your response in the chat instead of copying pasting, because that lets me know that you guys are working on this SAQ in the first place. And that you guys just want to do this after the lecture once I post the slides. No, I don't think it's necessary because I don't think people are going to read through all that while doing their SAQ at the same time. It's the halfway point. Does anyone have any questions? People are still working on the not so very short answer question. We have 3 minutes left to finish the SAQ. Now it's 2 minutes, sorry. At around 7:09, I want to see some responses. This is an adapted A-push SAQ from the exam. $7:09. See some responses, so that's good. 7:10. I will ask you to post your responses, unless not many of you guys did it, which is okay. I did see someone put a question mark next to part C, so we will clarify that. I do see 2 question marks actually, so we will go over that for a little bit. $7:10. Please start posting your responses. Pencils down, as they used to say, but it's digital exam, so screen's locked, I guess. Okay, let's read through some responses. So for part A, you were allowed to mention non-US stuff, yes. It says North America. Okay, let's start off with the top. Agriculture influenced migration by guiding Europeans to find food depending on the climate. Hmm. Let's read another response. Agriculture influenced migration to North America by providing land for people to settle in, giving opportunities to people to start a new life. And the last response that I see here is one way that agriculture influenced migration was the cultivation of tobacco. Tobacco was an exhaustive plant that required tons of labor to create an economy out of, leading Europeans to import slaves from Africa. Okay, so Emin mentioned a kind of forced migration, which is a valid answer. People, Insomnia and Star seem to be pointing on land for new opportunities. That's not necessarily. You're gonna have to explain a bit further about how that will lead to your questioning your responses. Another way of talking about it is also indentured servants, another type of migration to North America, because they were there to work in the Chesapeake initially, right? That's one thing we talked about. That one's a little bit of a difficult. Indentured servants worked in. Some indentured servants worked in plantations. That was the link with the tobacco as well. So the main thing I was focused on agriculture was tobacco. That's the key point with that. Does that make sense? And letting them type. Yeah. Okay. Let's look at part B. Europeans wanted certain goods, and so they allied with natives that had those goods, and vice versa. You're gonna have to explain a little bit more. You are close. Migration to North America affected colonial relations to natives, as previous relationships that were based on trading for fur were strained, as other colonists that wanted land for agriculture required more land and led to conflicts between the groups. That's a good point. To maintain the tobacco economy, Europeans sought to expand westwards to acquire more land, crossing Indian settlements by pursuing to cultivate the exhaustive plant and take Indian land. The colonists experienced military conflicts against the Native Americans. In regards to expanding westwards, that development doesn't become too huge in this period. It is more common in New England, the expansion westward, New England and the middle colonies. Nevertheless, it is a little close, but not hitting the nail directly. So the key point for this part was to look at tensions and conflicts over land and territories with the natives. The South and Chesapeake, mainly the Chesapeake. Part C. So you skipped it. Agriculture influenced both the middle colonies and the southern colonies to plant many crops that would be exported to other regions for food. Let's see, you skipped this one. Similarity of agriculture, yes. The middle colonies did have some degree of slavery. They will not have intense plantations for grains, but that's not exactly too huge. I should have mentioned that in some ways you can consider the Caribbean part of North America. Some scholars tend to consider that as part of North America. I don't know if College Board does that. But this question, I would have accepted if you assumed that the Caribbean would be part of North America. Which is a weird assumption to make, but some people do make that assumption. We'll skip part C because that seems to be the one that tripped up 2 people out of the 3 people who sent their responses. So let's go to part D. Briefly explain one difference in how agriculture influenced the development of 2 regions in North America. The agriculture affected the economy. Tobacco was helpful in the south, while crops weren't so focused on in the north. Good point. 4 you skipped. One difference between how agriculture influenced the development of 2 regions is the main industry. In the New England colonies, the rocky and soily terrain did not allow for cultivation of cash crops, so they relied on shipbuilding and trading. In the Chesapeake, the economy relied on cash crops such as tobacco, as the land was vast, flat, and rich. In some ways, this does talk about agriculture to some extent, fertility. So I would accept that answer as well. As for agriculture affected the economy, tobacco was helpful in the south while crops weren't so focused on in the north. I would have liked it more if you explained that a little bit more. Technically, you were dragging the agriculture part a little bit. It would have been better to explain that agriculture was self-sustaining or self-sufficient in the New England area. So there wasn't the development of or a reliance on slavery. That's one key point that I wanted to touch on. Part E. Explain one difference in labor systems as a result of agriculture in 2 regions in North America. I don't know why I added that there. Did I add that? That was part of the SAQ. I might have copied and pasted that and then forgot to delete it. It would be the same point as D. So if you said that, if you made that point in part E, slavery in the north and in the middle colonies, a difference in labor system was the usage of the encomienda system in Mexico with natives as opposed to the slavery from imported slaves in the British colonies. One difference in how agriculture influenced the labor system of 2 regions is the institution of slavery, southern regions. Yeah, okay. So, E and D. If you guys explain something about slavery, difference in slavery between New England and the South, in either D or E, I'll just take it for both E and D. I will actually remove that from that last part. Briefly explain one difference. Or I'll actually remove part E. Because that's not supposed to be there. I don't know why I forgot to delete that. In general, people did pretty well. The only thing that people seem to miss on is part C. Explain one similarity in how agriculture influenced the development of 2 regions in North America. You could have talked about the West Indies and the South, or compared the South to the middle colonies as well. You could have also compared the South to Spain as well, or the West Indies and New Spain as well. Those were some things you could have used as a as a dive board. For. Any questions about this SAQ? Part E should not be, aside from part E, because it's the same as part D essentially. If there are no more questions about that, we are going to... Oh, well, there's this. Please, feedback, please. I will reiterate, please give me some feedback. I know this lecture wasn't as spectacular as Unit 1. Thank you. There's the link. Please not sign it, but please fill it out. I did put on in summary, but we are reaching the end of time, so I will have to skip that part and ask questions. But if you guys do want me to go over the CED and some general developments that you guys should know, please let me know. Course and exam description. It's the only thing College Board has given us to work with. You made notes on it right before this session. Very proactive. Productive. Yeah, that's a good thing to do. Are there any more questions? Are there any questions on content and clarification? Speak now. You have none? Nope. No questions? Okay. In that case, we will conclude the lecture here. Please fill out that lecture form. Be brutally honest. I know this lecture was not as good as Unit 2, but please fill out that form so that you're giving me a brutal reminder that I did not do quite well, or did not meet quite the standards as I established in Unit 1. All right, I'll end the recording now.